Tonight we are exploring a teaching from the Zen Buddhist tradition called Not Knowing Mind. It is about what happens when we stop trying to have everything figured out, when we stop needing to be right all the time, when we loosen our grip on the plans and the opinions and the fixed ideas that take up so much of our energy every day. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Most of us spend a lot of our lives trying to control things, trying to know what is going to happen, how people see us, what we should do next. And it is tiring. The Zen teachers noticed this a long time ago, and they offered something simple in return. 3 words: I don't know. Not as a failure, not as giving up, but as a relief. That is what we will be sitting with tonight. There is nothing you need to do while you listen, nothing to take notes on, nothing to remember. Just let yourself rest, and we will go through it together. Thank you for joining us here at Midnight Monk. Let us begin. There is an old saying, passed down through the temples of the East for many, many centuries. It goes something like this. In the mind of the expert, there are few possibilities. In the mind of the beginner, there are many. Hear that just for a moment. The expert, who has studied for 40 years, who has read every book and earned every title, somehow holds a narrower view of the world than the beginner whose eyes are just opening for the first time. The beginner, who knows so little, somehow sees the whole sky. This is the strange and beautiful paradox we will sit with tonight. The Buddha himself, when he first taught his students more than 2,000 years ago beneath the great trees of an ancient forest, often spoke of how the mind that grasps too tightly cannot truly see. He compared the grasping mind to a closed fist. A closed fist cannot receive a gift. A closed fist cannot hold the hand of a friend. A closed fist cannot even feel the soft breeze of an evening on the back of its skin. Tonight, very slowly, with great care, we are learning to open the fist. Let us explore a story about an old Zen teacher who lived high in the mountains of a faraway land, in a small wooden temple where the wind moved through the pines and the bells hung silent from the eaves. He was known across the country for his wisdom. Travelers came from villages near and far, climbing the long stone steps to bring him their most pressing questions. One cool autumn morning, a young scholar arrived. He had walked for 3 days. His shoes were dusty. His robes were stained from the road. But tucked carefully inside his sleeve was a folded sheet of paper, and on that paper was a list of questions, written out in his finest hand. He bowed deeply at the temple gate. He bowed again at the doorway. And then he knelt before the old teacher, who was sitting very simply on a mat by an open window, watching the morning light move across the wooden floor. "Master," the young scholar said, "I have come a long way. I have come to learn the great truth. So I ask you first, what happens to us after we die?" The old teacher looked at him with eyes that were kind and warm and very still, and he said, simply, "I don't know." The scholar paused. He was quite sure he had not heard correctly. He unfolded his paper and tried again. "Then, Master, perhaps you can tell me this. What is the meaning of our suffering in this world?" The old teacher smiled. "I don't know." The scholar's hands began to tremble, just a little. "Master, surely, you can tell me at least this one thing. What is the highest teaching of the Buddha?" And again, The old teacher, with the same patient kindness in his eyes, said, "I don't know." The scholar sat back on his heels. He looked down at the dusty paper in his hands. He had walked 3 long days through cold mountain passes for these answers. He had imagined the words he would carry home. He had imagined the great wisdom he would lay before his teachers and his friends. Instead, he had received only 3 words, repeated 3 times. "Master," he said, almost in a whisper, "if you do not know, then what could you possibly teach me?" And the old teacher smiled once more. "I can teach you," he said, "to not know." The scholar did not understand. Not that day. Not for many days afterward. But something in the old teacher's face had touched him, and so he stayed. He swept the courtyard. He carried the water from the cold mountain stream. He sat in long silences beside the old teacher in the chill of early morning. And one evening, many months later, watching the last orange light fade from the high peaks, something in him began to loosen. He understood, just a little, what the old teacher had been giving him all along. Not an answer, but a freedom from needing one. This, dear listener, is the heart of what the Zen tradition came to call not knowing mind. It is not foolishness. It is not the absence of wisdom. It is, instead, a kind of patient, open courage. The courage to set down the heavy bag of certainty we have carried for so long, and to walk a few steps in the cool air without it. There is another old story, told for many centuries in the still temples of the East. It is about a different scholar and a different teacher. A learned man, very famous in his country, had heard whispers about a Zen teacher who lived in a mountain village. The scholar was full of his own knowledge. He had memorized every sacred text. He had debated every philosopher of his age. His students wrote down his words in careful books. His name was known in courts and in monasteries alike. But these whispers from the mountain village had reached him, and so he set out, perhaps a little to test her, perhaps to add her wisdom to his already great collection. When he arrived after many days of travel, the teacher welcomed him kindly. She was an old woman with calm hands and a low voice. She invited him to sit on a cushion near her window, where the late afternoon sun lay warm across the wooden floor. "You must be tired from such a long journey," she said. "Let me pour you some tea." The scholar sat very straight, very pleased with himself, and held out his porcelain cup. The teacher began to pour the tea slowly. The cup began to fill, and then, as the tea reached the rim, she kept pouring. The tea spilled over the edge of the cup, onto the saucer beneath it, and onto the wooden table, and at last began to drip into the scholar's fine robes. "Stop, stop," the scholar said, half rising from his cushion. "Master, the cup is full, cannot you see? No more will go in." The teacher set down the kettle very carefully. She looked at him with eyes that were not at all unkind, but very, very clear. "You are like this cup," she said. "You are so full of your own opinions, your own learning, your own ideas of how the world must be. How can I show you anything of Zen until you first empty your cup?" The scholar stood there for a long moment. The tea was still dripping from his sleeve, and something in him, very slowly, began to soften. He sat back down on the cushion. He set the cup on the table between them, and for the first time in many years, he simply sat. He did not argue. He did not speak. He did not try to win. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his long and decorated life, the warmth of an empty cup in his hands. This is the teaching, dear listener. It is not that we should know nothing. It is that we should not be so full of our own ideas, so sure of our own conclusions, so certain of how the world must be, that nothing new and nothing alive can ever enter us again. There was a great Zen teacher who lived not so very long ago, who traveled across the wide sea to teach in lands that had never heard of Zen before. He spoke in a low, even voice. His words were simple, and he left behind, among many other gifts, one short phrase that has been treasured ever since by those who heard it. He said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few. Let us sit with this for a breath." The expert, you see, has spent many long years gathering knowledge. She has built up, slowly and carefully, a great library inside herself. She knows how things should be done. She knows the answer, often before she has even heard the question. And there is real value in this. We are grateful for the experts in our lives. We are grateful for the wise old healer who has tended the sick for many decades. We are grateful for the carpenter who knows wood the way a mother knows the face of her child. But there is a hidden cost to all this knowing. The expert, in knowing so much, has slowly forgotten how to see freshly. She walks into a familiar room and already knows what the room will be. She greets an old friend and already knows what that friend will say. The world arrives to her wrapped in old labels and old judgments. And so the world, the actual breathing living world, slips past her unnoticed. The beginner is different. The beginner walks into the room and looks around with wide and curious eyes. The beginner does not yet know what the room is supposed to be, and so she sees what it actually is. She notices the slant of the late afternoon light against the wall. She notices the bowl of fruit on the table. She notices the warmth of the wooden floor beneath her bare feet. The beginner, in her not knowing, is closer to life itself. This is what the old teachers wanted us to remember. The Buddha himself, when he sat under the great fig tree on the night of his awakening, did not arrive at his understanding by gathering still more knowledge. He arrived at it by setting knowledge down, by becoming, in a humble way, a beginner once again. He looked at the suffering of the world with eyes that were not full of preconceived ideas. He simply looked. He simply saw. And in that simple, unguarded looking, the great truth of compassion opened to him like a flower opening to the morning. Let us explore a story about a master potter and his young apprentice. The master had been shaping clay on his wheel for 50 years. His hands were thick and strong, and they knew every secret of the wet earth. In his village, he was famous. People walked many days through hills and valleys to come and buy his bowls, his jars, and his beautiful teacups. Each piece he made was perfect. Each curve, each lip, each smooth, round body of clay was exactly as it should be. One spring, a young apprentice arrived at his door. She asked, very humbly, if she might learn from him. The master, after looking at her for a long, considering moment, agreed. For many months, the apprentice did not touch the clay at all. She only watched. She watched the master's hands rise and fall on the spinning wheel. She watched the clay seem to come alive under his fingers, rising up like a living creature being born from the earth. She watched the slow, patient breathing of the work. She watched and she watched, and she watched. When at last the master allowed her to sit at her own wheel, something very curious happened. Her first bowl was, of course, very crooked. It leaned to one side. The lip was uneven. The body was thicker on one side than the other. By any measure of the master's craft, it was a failure. But when the master came to look at it, he was silent for a long time. And then, at last, he spoke. "I have not seen a bowl like this," he said, "in 50 years. The apprentice was confused. "Master, it is not good. It is bent. It is crooked. It is the work of someone who does not yet know." The master shook his head slowly. "It is alive," he said. "When I shape a bowl, my hands already know what a bowl must be. They cannot help themselves. They make the same bowl I have made 1,000 times before. But your hands, dear apprentice, your hands did not yet know, and so they made something that I could not have made. There is a freshness in this clay that I lost long ago." The apprentice did not understand right away. She bowed and put the bowl aside. She practiced and practiced. As the months passed, her bowls grew straighter, her lips grew even. Her work began to look more and more like the master's own. She felt proud of this. She felt that she was becoming a true potter at last. But the master kept that first crooked bowl. He kept it on a small wooden shelf above his wheel. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the village was still and the lamps were dim, he would take it down and hold it in his rough old hands, and he would smile, a private smile. You see, the master had become so skillful that he had forgotten how to be surprised by his own hands. The apprentice, in her not knowing, still had access to a kind of mystery, a kind of aliveness that the master had to work very hard to find his way back to. This is what the old Zen teachers mean when they speak of beginner's mind. It is not foolishness. It is not ignorance. It is the open, alive, curious quality of a mind that has not yet decided what everything must be. And so, very slowly, we begin to ask, what would it be like to carry just a little of this beginner's mind into our own lives? Not as a great spiritual project, not as one more thing we must do well, just as a simple experiment, a patient loosening of the fist. Tomorrow morning, when you walk into your kitchen, you might pause for just one breath at the doorway. The kitchen you are entering is the same kitchen you entered yesterday, or so the expert in you will say. But what if, just for a moment, you let yourself enter as though you had never seen this room before? What if you noticed the morning light, the long shadows by the window, the way the air feels at this one particular hour of this one particular day? What if you let yourself be, for one slow breath, a beginner? Or when you next see someone you love, someone whose face you have known for many, many years, what if you allowed yourself to look at her freshly? The fine lines around her eyes that you stopped noticing long ago, the exact color of her hair in this light, the way she is holding her cup right now, in this one moment that has never happened before and will never happen again. The Buddha, in one of his earliest teachings, said something very simple. He said that all things are constantly arising and constantly passing away. Nothing in this world stands still. The kitchen you enter tomorrow is not the kitchen of yesterday. The face of the person you love is not the face of last week. The world is, in every moment, becoming new. It is only our knowing, our certainty, our weary need to control that holds it still in our minds, like a flower pressed into the page of an old book. To set down the knowing, even for one breath, is to let the world be alive again. To soften the need to control, even for one moment, is to let life surprise us. This is the simple invitation of not knowing mind. Not a heavy practice, not a great striving, simply a willingness, every now and then, to soften, to open the fist, to let the cup be empty, to let life pour in. Let us pause here, just for a moment. Notice the breath moving in and out of you, all on its own. Notice how the body is feeling. And when you are ready, we will continue together. One autumn, a young Buddhist monk set out on foot toward a monastery he had never seen. He had been studying for several years at a temple in the lowlands, reading the sutras, sitting in meditation each morning and evening, learning the chants and the rituals of the tradition. He was earnest. He was disciplined. He believed he was making real progress on the path. And then his teacher called him in one morning and said, "You have learned enough from books. Go to the monastery in the mountains. Stay there. See what happens." So the monk packed a cloth bundle with a few belongings, bowed to his teacher, and began walking. The road wound for days through farming villages and wide river valleys. He passed market squares where merchants argued over the price of grain. He crossed bridges of old stone with moss growing between the cracks. He slept at the roadside under broad trees whose roots reached out over the path. And then the road narrowed and began to climb, and the world around him started to change. The air grew cooler. The villages fell away behind him. The trees were different here, taller and darker, heavy with shadow. And the sounds were different too. Where the lowlands had been full of voices and carts and animal cries, the mountains held a deep, steady hush that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was somewhere on that climb, between the world he had always known and the world he was walking into, that something unexpected happened to him. He began to notice his own mind at work. Not his thoughts, exactly. He had been watching thoughts for years in meditation. This was different. What he noticed now, perhaps for the first time, was something subtler. Something happening so fast and so constantly that he had never caught it before. He would look at a tree beside the path, and before his eyes had finished taking it in, his mind had already arrived with the word tree. He would glance at a stone, and the label stone was there before the seeing was complete. The sky above was already sky. The path beneath his feet was already path. The mountain ahead was already mountain. Each thing he looked at reached him pre-wrapped in a name, a category, a judgment. It was as if his mind were a painter working just ahead of his eyes, brushing a thin layer of meaning over every surface before he could touch it directly. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the road and looked down at his own hands. And even there, even in something so close and so familiar, he could feel the mind arriving first. The word hand was already there before the actual sensation of skin and warmth and weight could reach him. He had spent years assuming he was seeing the world as it truly was. Now, standing on a mountain road with dust on his feet and his bundle over his shoulder, he began to understand that he had been seeing something else entirely. He had been seeing his own descriptions of the world, his own running translation of experience into words and ideas and opinions. And between those descriptions and the actual living world, there was a gap he had never noticed. A kind of veil, thin and invisible, woven from a lifetime of naming things. He sat down on a flat stone at the side of the road. He set his bundle beside him, and he watched. He watched his mind paint the rocks, paint the trees, paint the light, paint the clouds, paint even the silence. Everything it touched, it named. Everything it reached, it covered. He stayed there for a very long time. When he finally arrived at the monastery, days later, the labeling did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. He walked through the gate, and his mind said, "Gate." He saw the main hall, and his mind said, "Building." He was shown to the kitchen, and his mind said, "Kitchen." The other monks became categories: young, serious, friendly, stern. He lay on his mat that first night and watched it happen even in the dark. The sound of wind became wind. The creak of the wooden building became old building settling. The faint chanting from the meditation hall became evening practice. And between each label and the thing itself, that same invisible veil, so thin he had never noticed it before and now could not stop seeing. What this monk had stumbled into, alone on his mountain road, was one of the oldest observations in all of Buddhist teaching. The Buddha himself spoke about this more than 2,000 years ago. He noticed that the human mind, from the moment it wakes to the moment sleep comes at night, is ceaselessly reaching out, grasping at every sight and sound and sensation, and immediately wrapping it in layers of reaction. We see a face, and the mind has already decided, friend or stranger, interesting or dull, someone to trust or someone to avoid. We hear a sound, and it has already been sorted, pleasant or harsh, worth listening to or safely ignored. We taste food, and the verdict arrives before the taste has even finished. This happens so fast and so constantly that we never catch it happening. We believe we are meeting the world directly. But what we are actually meeting, the Buddha taught, is our own reaction to the world, our own opinion of it, our own running commentary about it. Think of how many times today alone you have looked at something and had the mind arrive before the looking was finished. A chair is not just a chair. It is my chair, or an ugly chair, or a chair that needs fixing. A person walking past is not just a person. She is a stranger, or someone who looks tired, or someone who reminds me of my sister. The mind cannot help itself. It names, it sorts, it judges, it files. It has been doing this since we were very young, and it does it so well that we have forgotten it is doing it at all. And this matters more than it might seem, because this invisible commentary shapes everything. It decides what we notice and what we miss. It determines who we listen to and who we dismiss. It builds, brick by invisible brick, the entire world we think we are living in. And we never once question it, because we never once see that it is there. The Zen tradition, which carried this insight forward through the centuries, put it with characteristic directness. They said, "You are not seeing the mountain. You are seeing your idea of the mountain, and your idea of it is not it." There is a story from the Zen tradition about a teacher who lived in a hermitage beside a mountain lake. She had been guiding students for many years, and she had a particular way of meeting anyone who came to study with her. When a new student arrived, before anything else, she would walk with them down to the water at dusk. They would stand together at the edge, the light fading around them, and she would ask one question: "What do you see?" Students always had answers ready. "I see the lake, Master. I see the mountains reflected in the water. I see the color of the sky turning. I see a heron standing among the reeds." The Master would listen, and then she would shake her head. "You are giving me the names of things," she would say. "I did not ask what you can name. I asked what you see." Most students could not understand the difference. They would try again, reaching for more careful words, more detailed descriptions. "I see the golden light touching the water. I see the dark shapes of pines against the sky. I see the mist beginning to rise from the far shore." But each time, the Master would shake her head. "Still names," she would say. "Still labels. The mind talking about what is here, instead of what is here." This went on, student after student, year after year. Many grew frustrated and left, certain the teacher was being unreasonable. But one student, who arrived at the lake with the Master on a cool autumn evening, stood at the water's edge for a very long time without speaking. The light shifted around them. The water darkened. The first stars appeared above the peaks. The air grew cool against their skin. And at last this student said, very simply, "I do not know what I see." The Master turned to look at her, and for the first time, she smiled. "Now," she said, "you are beginning to see." What did the Master mean? She did not mean that the student's eyes had stopped working. She meant that, for a breath, the student had stopped naming. She had set down the words lake and mountain and sky and heron. And in that setting down, something else had come through. Not a better description, not a more poetic answer. Just the raw, wordless, breathing experience of standing beside water as evening fell, alive and present and without a single label between herself and the world. The Zen teachers sometimes called this seeing before the word arrives. It is the fraction of a moment, right before the mind wraps its name around a thing, when we meet that thing as it actually is. It is so brief that most of us never notice it. But it is always there, beneath every label, beneath every opinion, beneath every judgment we have ever made about anything we have ever seen. The Diamond Sutra, one of the most treasured texts in all of Buddhism, speaks to this truth. It says that all we believe we know about the world is like a dream, a flash of lightning, a dewdrop on the grass at dawn. Not because the world is unreal, but because our certainty about it, our confidence that we have figured it out, is always dissolving, always giving way to something we had not expected. This is not a teaching about confusion. It is a teaching about freedom. When we hold our ideas about the world loosely, when we remain willing to be surprised, we become available to what is actually happening. We stop defending yesterday's map and start walking through today's territory. When we stop insisting that we already know, the world opens wider than we had imagined. There is another story, told among Buddhist students for many generations, about a monk who had been practicing meditation for years and was proud of the steadiness of his mind. He traveled a great distance to visit a Zen teacher, hoping for recognition. When he arrived, the teacher invited him to sit and tell her about his practice. The monk spoke with visible pride. "My concentration is deep," he said. "My mind has become clear and undisturbed. It is like a mirror that has been polished until it shines. Everything reflects in it without distortion. The teacher listened with patience. When the monk had finished, she said, "You have done fine work with the mirror. It is bright. But tell me something. What have you seen in it?" The monk opened his mouth and then closed it. He realized that he had spent every one of those years polishing the surface and had never once looked at what it was reflecting. "This is the difficulty," the teacher said. "We can spend a lifetime sharpening the instrument, clearing the mind, perfecting our attention. But the seeing itself, when it finally comes, asks something different of us. It asks us to put the instrument down." The monk sat with this. Something uncomfortable stirred in his chest, a kind of loosening he had not anticipated. After a while, he asked, "How do I put it down?" The teacher stood and pointed toward the courtyard. "Go outside," she said. "Stand beneath that tree, and for one breath, do not call it a tree." The monk went outside. He stood beneath the branches. Leaves moved above him in the wind. He tried, for one breath, to stand there without the word arriving. He could not do it the first time. The labeled tree was there before he had finished drawing breath. He tried again. Tree arrived once more, fast and automatic, like a reflex. On the third breath, something shifted. The word was late. And in that gap, the world flooded in. Color, texture, the play of light through leaves, the smell of bark and damp earth, the sound of the wind moving through branches. All of it arrived at once, without names, without edges, without any separation between the world and the person standing in it. He went back inside. He could not describe what had happened. But the teacher looked at his face and understood. "Good," she said. "Now we can begin." Years later, this monk would tell his own students about that afternoon. He would say that all his years of meditation, all his effort to build a clear mind, were not wasted. They had prepared him. But the moment that changed everything was not a moment of achievement. It was a moment of surrender. A moment when he stopped trying to see correctly and simply allowed himself to see. When the labels fell away and the world, for one breath, was just the world, vivid and whole and unreasonable and there. What the Zen masters discovered, and what the Buddha was pointing to all those centuries before them, is not something far away or reserved for people in monasteries. It is happening right here, right now, in this breath. You may have tasted it yourself without knowing what to call it. Perhaps you were watching the sky one evening and, for an instant, the word sky fell away. What was left was something wider than any name could hold. Or perhaps you were listening to rain, and for a heartbeat you heard it before the mind said rain. In that instant there was just the sound, and you, and nothing between the two. These moments come and go. We cannot force them, but we can begin to notice when they happen. And we can begin to understand what the Buddhist teachers have understood for a very long time. That the veil between us and the living world is made of nothing more than our own habits of mind. It is spun from names and opinions and reactions that we have been layering down since we were children, so constantly and so automatically that we forget they are there. But the veil is not a wall. It is not made of stone or iron. It is made of thought. And thought, as the Buddha reminded us again and again, is not permanent. It comes. It goes. It rises and it falls away. And in the falling away, there is always a gap. There is always a moment of openness if we are willing to notice it. The monk on the mountain road noticed it. The student standing beside the lake noticed it. The monk beneath the tree, who stopped calling it a tree for just one breath, noticed it. And it parts easily. It has always been ready to part. Not knowing mind is what parts it. When we ease our grip on certainty, when we stop demanding that everything be named and sorted and filed away before we can rest, the world comes closer. Not a different world. This world. The one that has been here all along, waiting for us to meet it. Let us rest here for a breath or two. There is nothing to figure out, nothing to hold. Just this moment, just as it is. And when you are ready, we will continue together. In a weaving village, in a time when the Buddha still walked the dusty roads of the world, there lived a young woman who had grown up beside the loom. She had learned the craft from her mother, who had learned it from hers. Her days were shaped by thread and rhythm, by the creak of the wooden frame and the hum of fiber drawn tight. She knew the feel of raw cotton between her fingers, how different dyes smelled in the morning heat, the satisfying moment when a finished cloth was lifted from the frame and held up to the light. By the time she was 16, she could weave cloth that people admired, though she was too young to think much about that. She simply wove because it was the life she knew, and she was at home in it. One day, the Buddha came to her village to teach. This was not unusual. In those years, the Buddha traveled from town to town, offering his teaching to whoever wished to listen. He taught farmers and scholars, servants and merchants, mothers and kings. His language was plain. His presence was unhurried, and people came from far away, sometimes walking for days, just to sit near him and hear what he had to say. The young woman went to the gathering with the rest of her village. She found a place at the back of the crowd, her hands calloused from the day's work, and she listened. The Buddha spoke that day about something that most people prefer not to look at too closely. He spoke about the brevity of life. He did not speak about it with heaviness. He did not try to frighten anyone. He spoke about it with a kind of clarity and care, as a person might describe a candle flame to someone who has never noticed how beautifully it moves and how briefly it burns. He said that most of us live as if we have endless time. We put off the conversations that matter. We delay the kindness we mean to show. We walk through our days in a kind of comfortable fog, assuming there will always be another morning, another chance, another year in which to do the things we keep meaning to do. And for many of us, there may well be another year. But the truth, the Buddha said, is that we do not know. We have never known. We simply act as if we do, because the not knowing feels uncomfortable, and we would rather not sit with it. He said that this is natural, that it is human, but that it carries a cost. Because when we live as if time stretches out endlessly before us, we tend to drift. We tend to sleepwalk through the very days that are the most precious thing we will ever be given. And so, he said, it is wise to do something that may seem strange at first. It is wise to bring the awareness of life's brevity close, not as a burden, not as a source of anxiety, but as a kind of companion, a reminder carried with you through the day that this morning, this conversation, this cup of tea shared with someone you love is not something that will happen forever. It is happening now, and now is the only time it will ever happen. Those who carry this awareness, the Buddha said, do not crumble under its weight. They are freed by it. They live with a clarity and a warmth that others can feel, even if they cannot name it. And when their own life reaches its natural close, they meet that moment with open eyes, because they have been practicing openness all along. The young woman at the back of the gathering heard all of this, and something in her, something she could not have explained to anyone at the time, took it very seriously. She went home that evening and sat down at the loom. The shuttle moved in her hands. The thread pulled tight, and as she worked, the Buddha's words stayed with her, not as a list of ideas to think about, but as something alive, something that had settled into her body and was asking to be felt. She began that night what she would continue for the next 3 years. Each morning, before she sat down to weave, she would take a few moments of stillness. She would sit with herself and let the truth of impermanence settle over her. Not as a frightening idea, not as something heavy, but as something honest. This day is here. It will not return. And she would let that truth wake her up, like cool water on the face in the morning. Over time, this changed her. Not in any way that a stranger would have noticed. She still wove cloth. She still swept the floor of her family's home. She still walked the village lanes in the evening and sat with friends under the trees when the air grew cool. But something in how she moved through her days was different now. She was more patient. She listened more carefully when someone spoke to her. She did not rush through her meals or hurry past the flowers growing along the roadside. When her mother was unwell one winter, she cared for her with a tenderness that surprised them both, a tenderness born not from duty, but from the understanding that these days together were not guaranteed. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The exact way the light came through the window of the weaving room in the hour after sunrise. The particular sound her mother's voice made when calling her name from across the courtyard. The feeling of warm bread in her hands at the end of a working day. The color of the sky just before dark, different every evening, never the same twice. Each of these had always been there. But now she was present for them in a way she had not been before. It was as if a thin film had been lifted from her eyes, and the world beneath it was more vivid, more immediate, more alive than she had realized. 3 years passed. She was now 19. And then, the Buddha returned to her village. Word traveled ahead of him, and a crowd gathered once more, eager to hear him speak. The young woman came too, carrying a bundle of freshly woven cloth she was delivering to a neighbor. The Buddha, it is said, could sense something different about her. Among all the people gathered that day, she stood out. Not because of anything visible, not because she was dressed differently or standing in a particular place, but because something in her had changed in a way that the Buddha, with his deep attention, could feel. And so, instead of beginning his teaching, he turned to her. "Young woman," he said, "tell me, where are you coming from?" She looked at the Buddha, and she answered simply, "I don't know." A ripple went through the crowd. People turned to one another. Some frowned. It seemed impolite. The Buddha had asked a simple question. Everyone could see that she had come from the direction of the weaving quarter. Her hands were dusty from the loom. Why would she say she did not know? The Buddha, undisturbed, asked a second question. "Where are you going?" And again she answered, "I don't know." Now the crowd grew restless. Voices muttered at the edges. A few older men shook their heads. This young woman, standing there with her bundle of cloth, was speaking to the most revered teacher of the age in a way that seemed careless, perhaps even rude. Someone near the front whispered, "She should show more respect." Someone else said, "She clearly does not understand the question." But the Buddha seemed entirely at ease. He raised his hand and the voices fell away. He looked at the young woman with steady, attentive eyes, and he asked a third question. "Do you not know?" And this time she said, "I know." The crowd stirred again. And then the Buddha asked once more, "Do you know?" "I don't know," she said. By now, the gathering was bewildered. The four answers seemed contradictory, even nonsensical. Some in the crowd were openly annoyed. They had come to hear a teaching, not to watch a young weaver give puzzling replies. But the Buddha looked at her steadily, and he smiled. "Please," he said, "help them understand." The young woman nodded. She set her bundle of cloth on the ground and spoke clearly, so everyone could hear. "When you asked me where I was coming from," she said, "I knew you could see the cloth in my arms. You could see which road I had walked. You were not asking about the road. You were asking something deeper. Where did I come from before this life? What was I before I was born into this world?" And I answered honestly, "I don't know. No one knows." The crowd grew very still. "When you asked me where I was going," she continued, "I knew you were not asking about the neighbor's house where I am bringing this cloth. You were asking where I will go when this life is over. What becomes of me then? And to that also, I must say truthfully, I don't know." She paused, and the silence around her deepened. "When you asked, 'Do you not know?' you were asking whether I understand that this life will come to an end. That I too will one day leave this world. And to that I said, I know. I know it well. I have carried that awareness with me every morning for 3 years, as you once taught us. And it has changed everything about the way I live." She took a breath. "And when you asked me, 'Do you know?' you were asking whether I know when. When will that day arrive? And to that I said, I don't know. Because I do not. No one does. Not the wisest teacher. Not the oldest woman in the village. Not even you, if I may say so." The Buddha looked at her for a long moment. And then he said, to the entire gathering, "She has understood." The crowd was transformed. What had seemed like rudeness had revealed itself as the deepest kind of honesty. Here was a woman of 19 who had looked at the 4 great questions that surround every human life and had answered each one with a clarity that many who had studied for decades had not reached. She knew what she could not know, and she was at peace with it. She knew what she could know, and she had lived it with her whole heart. The Buddha, it is said, praised her before the entire assembly. He said that her understanding was rare and genuine, and that her answers held more truth than many elaborate teachings. He said that she had done something that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. She had looked at what is true, without turning away, without softening it into comfortable philosophy, without pretending to know more than she did. And in that honest looking, she had found a kind of peace that no amount of knowledge could provide. The people who had criticized her moments before now sat in silence. Some of them, it is said, felt something shift in their own understanding that afternoon. They had come to hear wisdom from the Buddha, and wisdom had come instead from a young woman with calloused hands and a bundle of cloth at her feet. This story has been passed down through the Buddhist tradition for many centuries. It has been told in temples and monasteries, in villages and in cities, by teachers and by students, from one generation to the next. And it endures because it touches something that lives in every person who hears it. We all carry these 4 questions, whether we speak them or not. Where did we come from before this life? We don't know. Where will we go when this life is over? We don't know. Do we understand that life is brief and precious? If we have truly looked, yes, we do. Do we know when our time here will end? No, we never do. And there is a kind of peace that comes, not from answering these questions, but from being honest about them. From standing where the weaver's daughter stood, before a crowd of people, and saying with a clear voice, "This is what I know, and this is what I do not know, and I am not afraid of either." The Buddhist tradition does not ask us to have answers to these questions. It asks us to live with them, to hold them with care, to let them deepen our attention rather than sharpen our fear. And the weaver's daughter showed, with her 4 plain answers, that a person who lives this way is not diminished by what she does not know. She is made more whole by it. This is perhaps the deepest place that not knowing mind can take us. It is not only about loosening our grip on everyday opinions and fixed ideas, though it includes that. It is also about learning to live honestly with the great mysteries that surround every human life. We do not know where we came from. We do not know where we are going. But we are here, right now, breathing, listening, alive in this one unrepeatable moment. The weaver's daughter did not learn anything that the rest of us do not already know, somewhere beneath the surface. She simply allowed herself to feel it. She let the Buddha's teaching enter her, not as philosophy, not as theory, but as something that changed the texture of her days. And in doing so, she found a kind of freedom that had nothing to do with having answers and everything to do with being present. In the Buddhist tradition, this is sometimes spoken of as right understanding. Not understanding in the sense of having figured everything out, but understanding in the sense of seeing clearly what is true and finding peace in that seeing, even when much remains unknown. The young woman carried this understanding well. It did not make her solemn or withdrawn. By all accounts, she continued to weave, to laugh, to live with the same warmth she had always shown. But there was a steadiness in her now, a kind of presence that the people around her could feel. She held each day the way you might hold something borrowed, knowing it is not yours to keep, and treasuring it all the more for that. Not long after that gathering, her own life came to its close, sooner than anyone around her expected. Such things happen. They happen in every age and in every village. But she met that moment, by all accounts, as she had met every morning for those 3 years. With clear eyes, with a heart that was open, and without the fear that comes from believing we were owed more time than we were given. She had learned what the Buddha tried to teach in every village he visited, that the preciousness of life is not that it goes on forever. It is that it is here at all. Let us pause. Let whatever has stirred in you have its space. There is no need to hold anything tightly. And when you feel ready, we will continue together. we spend so much of our lives searching for the right answer. The one sentence that will make everything clear. The one piece of wisdom that, once heard, will settle the mind forever and solve the puzzle of being alive. If we could just find it, we think, everything would fall into place. We would know how to live. We would know what to say in every situation. We would know who to be when trouble comes, and who to be when joy comes, and who to be in the ordinary hours between. And so we search. We read books. We listen to teachers. We turn questions over in our minds late into the night, collecting ideas and principles and philosophies, hoping that somewhere in all of it, the answer is waiting. What if the answer is not what we think it is? What if the wisest people who have ever lived did not carry a fixed answer at all, but something else entirely? The Zen tradition has something to say about this, and it is not what most of us expect. Let us explore a story about a Zen master who had been teaching for most of his life. He was very old by now. He had spent decades receiving students, answering their questions, guiding them through the tangles of their own minds. His temple had become well known. People traveled from far away to sit with him and to hear what he had to say. One afternoon, a young monk arrived. He was bright and eager, full of energy, and he had a question he had been carrying with him for a long time. He had heard that this master was one of the wisest Zen teachers alive, and he wanted something definitive. He wanted the heart of it, the core, the thing that mattered most. He knelt before the old master, who was sitting in the temple garden, pulling weeds from between the stones. The afternoon light was warm. Somewhere behind the garden wall, a stream was running. The master's hands were brown and unhurried in the earth. "Master," the young monk said, "you have been teaching for a lifetime. You have spoken to thousands of students. You have given countless talks and answered countless questions. So I ask you now, what is the teaching of a lifetime? If you could say only one thing, after all these years, what would it be?" The master continued pulling weeds for a moment. His fingers worked around the roots with patience. Then he looked up. His face was calm and clear, and he said 2 words: "Appropriate response." The young monk waited. Surely there was more. Surely the master would explain, would elaborate, would offer the philosophy behind these 2 plain words. But the master had already turned back to his garden. His hands were back in the earth. A beetle crossed the stone between them. The stream went on running behind the wall. That was the whole answer. Appropriate response. The young monk sat there for a long time, confused and more than a little disappointed. He had walked a great distance for this. He had imagined something grand. A revelation. A doorway flung open into deep understanding. Instead, he had been given 2 words that sounded more like practical advice than spiritual wisdom. He thanked the master and left the garden that afternoon, feeling he had wasted his journey. It was only later, much later, that he began to understand what he had been given. Not immediately, not in a single flash of insight, but slowly, over months and years, as he tried to live those 2 words in his own life, their meaning deepened and widened until they held more than any book he had ever read. What did the master mean? He meant that after all his years of practice, after all his study of the Buddhist teachings, after all his meditation and his reading and his encounters with thousands of different people in thousands of different moments, What he had arrived at was not a fixed truth, not a doctrine, not a formula that could be written down and applied in every situation. What he had arrived at was something alive, a capacity, the ability to meet whatever moment appeared in front of him and to respond to it in a way that fit. Not a response he had prepared in advance, not a response borrowed from a book or copied from another teacher, but a response that arose naturally in that moment, from a mind that was open and attentive and not clinging to any predetermined idea of what should happen next. Think about what this means. A person comes to you in distress. You could offer advice. You could offer comfort. You could offer silence. You could offer a question. You could offer a cup of tea. Any one of these might be the appropriate response. And the only way to know which one is right is to be fully present with this person in this moment without having decided in advance. A Zen teacher was once asked how he knew what to say to his students. He said, "I don't know until they sit down in front of me. When I see their face, when I hear their voice, when I feel what is in the room between us, then something arises. Not from my knowledge, from the meeting itself. This is a very different kind of wisdom than most of us are taught to seek. Most of us are taught that wisdom means knowing the right answer, that a wise person is someone who has figured everything out and can tell you what to do. But the Zen tradition suggests something else. It suggests that the deepest wisdom is not about knowing the answer. It is about being present enough and open enough to let the right response come. And this, of course, is where not knowing mind becomes essential. Because if we already know what we are going to say, if we have already decided how this conversation will go, if we have already scripted our response before the other person has finished speaking, then we are not responding to this moment. We are responding to our idea of this moment. And those, as we are learning, are not the same thing. The Buddha himself was perhaps the greatest example of this kind of living wisdom. There is a tradition in Buddhism that says the Buddha never gave the same teaching twice. Not because he was trying to be unpredictable, but because he was paying such close attention to the person in front of him that his teaching naturally changed shape each time. A farmer received one kind of teaching. A grieving mother received another. A proud scholar received something else entirely. A child received something simpler and truer than all the rest. The words were different. The tone was different. The stories were different. Even the length was different. What remained constant was not the content, but the attention behind it. There is a story that the Buddha was once asked why he taught so many different things to so many different people. "Are not your teachings contradictory?" the questioner asked. And the Buddha said, "If a doctor gives the same medicine to every patient, regardless of their illness, is that a good doctor? A good doctor looks at the patient who is in front of him and gives the medicine that patient needs." In the Buddhist tradition, this is sometimes called skillful means. It is the art of offering exactly what is needed, not a word more, not a word less, in this particular moment, to this particular person. And it cannot be learned from a book or memorized as a set of rules, because no rule can tell you what this person, right now, in this breath, needs to hear. It can only come from a mind that is willing to not know in advance. A mind that arrives in the conversation without a predetermined conclusion. A mind that trusts the meeting itself to reveal what is needed. There is another story told in the Zen monasteries about a teacher who was visited by 3 different students on the same day. Each one came with the same question. The first student arrived in the morning. He was restless, full of plans and ambitions, always moving, always doing, unable to sit with himself for more than a few minutes before some new idea sent him leaping up again. He knelt before the teacher and said, "Master, I feel lost. What should I do?" The teacher looked at him for a long moment. She saw his restless hands, his darting eyes, the energy buzzing through his body like wind through a field of grass. And she said, "Stop doing. Sit down. Be completely still." The second student arrived at midday. She was the opposite of the first. She had been meditating for years, sitting for hours each day, growing more and more withdrawn from the world around her. She rarely spoke. She rarely acted. She had become so devoted to stillness that she had nearly disappeared from the life of the monastery. She knelt before the teacher and asked the same question. "Master, I feel lost. What should I do?" The teacher looked at her. She saw the pallor of someone who has been indoors too long, the heaviness of someone who has mistaken withdrawal for peace. And she said, "Get up. Go into the village. Find something useful to do with your hands. Feel the sun on your face." The third student arrived in the evening. He was someone who talked constantly, filling every silence with words, analyzing everything, debating everything, never resting in his own experience because his mind was always turning it into ideas and arguments. He knelt before the teacher. "Master, I feel lost. What should I do?" The teacher saw the fatigue behind his eyes, the weariness of a mind that never stops talking to itself. She said, "Close your mouth. Open your ears. Listen to what is already here." Now, a fourth student had been sitting nearby all day, watching these 3 encounters. And when the third student left, this fourth student came forward, looking puzzled. "Master," she said, "all 3 of them asked the same question, and you gave 3 completely different answers. Which one was the true teaching?" The teacher smiled. "All 3, she said. "But how can that be? They contradict each other. You told one to be still and another to act. You told one to listen and another to go out and work. They were 3 different people," the teacher said, "in 3 different conditions of the heart. The question was the same, yes, but the appropriate response was not. A person who is drowning does not need the same help as a person who is afraid to enter the water." This is one of the most freeing ideas in all of Zen Buddhism, that there is no single correct response to life. There is no formula. There is no script we are supposed to follow. There is only this moment and our willingness to meet it honestly. Think of how much energy we spend trying to figure out the right thing to say. Before a difficult conversation, we rehearse our words in our heads, sometimes for hours. We try out different sentences. We imagine the other person's reaction. We build entire dialogues that have not happened yet and may never happen, trying to get our lines right in advance. We do this before job interviews. We do this before apologies. We do this before asking for something we want or telling someone something we are afraid to say. We script and revise and rehearse as if life were a performance and we are trying to get our part right before the curtain goes up. And then the actual conversation arrives, and it is nothing like what we planned. The other person says something we did not expect. The feeling in the room is different from what we imagined. our rehearsed words feel strange in our mouths, and all our preparation falls away, and we are left standing in the raw, unrehearsed moment with no script and no plan. And often, that is exactly when we say the truest thing we have ever said. Not the words we practiced. Something else. Something that comes from being here, in this unplanned moment, with no defenses and no performance. The Zen masters would say, "Good." That is where the real response can come from. Not from the script, not from the plan, but from the open, attentive, unscripted mind that is simply here, simply present, simply willing to meet what is in front of it. There is a Buddhist teaching that compares the awakened mind to water. Water does not decide in advance what shape it will take. It does not plan its path down the mountainside. It does not argue with the rocks in its way or wish the ground were different. It simply meets whatever terrain it encounters, and it responds. It flows around stones. It pools in hollows. It falls where there is a cliff and runs flat where the ground is level. It is always the same water, but it is never the same shape twice. This is what the old Zen master meant when he said, appropriate response. He was not offering a technique or a strategy. He was describing a way of being alive, a mind like water, a life that responds to what is actually here, not to what we wish were here, or fear might be here, or have decided in advance must be here. And it begins, always, with not knowing, with the willingness to arrive in each new moment without a fixed idea of what it requires, without the assumption that we already know what is needed, without the script we have been writing in our heads since yesterday. The Zen teachers were not suggesting that preparation is useless. They were not saying we should wander through life without thought or care. They were pointing to something subtler. They were saying that when the moment actually arrives, when the person is standing in front of us, when the situation is unfolding in real time, the wisest thing we can do is set the script aside and be here, fully here, open to what is actually happening, ready to respond, not from our plan, but from our presence. The young monk who visited the old master's garden that afternoon did not understand this right away. It took him many years. But eventually, through his own practice and his own encounters with life, he came to see what the master had given him. Not an answer, something better than an answer. A way of being in the world that did not depend on having answers at all. And when his own students came to him years later and asked him the same question, he found himself saying different things to different people. Not because he was clever, but because he was listening, because he was present, because his mind, having learned to let go of the need to know in advance, was free to respond to what was actually there. Let us pause here. Let the body be at ease. And when you are ready, we will continue together. There is a story about two young men who worked together in the kitchen of a Buddhist monastery. They had been there for over a year. They chopped vegetables side by side in the early mornings when the kitchen was still cool and the light was just beginning to come through the high windows. They hauled water from the well in heavy wooden buckets. They scrubbed the great iron pots in the evening after the community had eaten. And over those months, as tends to happen when people work closely together, day after day, in the steam and the smoke and the clatter, they had become friends. They had an easy way with each other, a rhythm of jokes and teasing and familiar shorthand that made the hard work lighter. Each one knew what would make the other laugh. Each one could finish the other's sentences. One morning, one of them walked into the kitchen at the start of his shift. The fire was already lit. The other was already there, standing by the cutting table, having just arrived himself. Without thinking, without pausing, without even looking closely at his friend's face, the first one launched into their usual banter. He made a joke about the head cook. He complained about the cold water in the well. He started telling a story about something funny that had happened the night before in the meditation hall. His friend said nothing. The first one kept talking. He was used to the rhythm between them. He knew this friend. He knew what made him laugh. He knew the shape of their conversations. And so he kept going, filling the kitchen with his familiar, easy energy. It was only later that morning, when another monk pulled him aside, that he learned what had happened. His friend had received word just before dawn that someone very close to him, someone he had grown up with, had passed away suddenly. He had come to the kitchen carrying that weight, and he had been met with jokes. This is not a story about cruelty. The young man in the kitchen was not unkind. He was, in fact, a warm and caring person. What he was, in that moment, was certain. He was certain he knew who his friend was. He was certain he knew what their relationship looked like. He was certain, without even thinking about it, that the person standing in front of him this morning was the same person who had stood in front of him yesterday and the day before and the day before that. He had painted a picture of his friend in his mind, and he was so familiar with that picture that he no longer looked at the actual person. This is something we do with nearly everyone we know. The Buddhist tradition speaks about it with great directness. We create an image of a person based on past experience, and then we carry that image forward, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and we interact with the image rather than with the living, breathing, changing human being in front of us. Our partner becomes a fixed idea. Our mother becomes a fixed idea. Our colleague, our neighbor, our closest friend. We know them. We know what they will say, how they will react, what they care about, and what they don't. And in that knowing, something is lost. What is lost is the person as they actually are, right now, in this moment, which may be very different from who they were yesterday. The Zen tradition has a way of putting this that is both simple and direct. They say, the person you knew yesterday no longer exists. The person standing in front of you now has never existed before this moment. Every cell in her body is different. Every thought in her mind is different. Her morning was different from any morning she has ever had. Something happened between then and now, even if it was something as ordinary as a dream she cannot quite remember, or a feeling that arrived while she was drinking her morning tea. She is new, and if we cannot see that, it is not because she has not changed. It is because we are not looking. The Buddha taught that all things are impermanent. He said it again and again, in village after village, in teaching after teaching. All things change. The weather changes. The seasons change. The body changes. The mind changes. Nothing stays fixed. And yet, when it comes to the people in our lives, we often act as if they are permanent. We carry around a portrait of them in our heads, painted months or years ago, and we forget to look up and see who is actually standing in front of us. The young man in the kitchen learned something that morning that stayed with him. He learned that his knowing, his comfortable certainty about who his friend was, had blinded him to what was actually happening. His friend had walked through the door in a completely different state than anything he had seen before, and he had not noticed. Because he was not looking. He was remembering. This is what the Zen tradition means when it speaks of meeting each person as if for the first time. Not pretending that we have no history with them. Not ignoring what we have learned. But holding all of that lightly enough that we can see what is here now, in this particular moment, which may be something we have never encountered before. There is a Buddhist teacher who speaks about this in a way that has stayed with many of his students. He says that when people come to him for conversation, he tries to meet each one as though he has never met them before. Even people he has spoken with many times. Even people whose stories he knows well. He does not pretend to have forgotten their past conversations. He simply does not assume that the past will tell him what is happening now. He arrives in each encounter with a kind of openness, a willingness to be surprised, a readiness to discover that the person sitting in front of him today may be someone he has never fully met. He has said that sometimes people come to him wanting to correct an impression they left during a previous conversation. They want to clarify something, to adjust the picture he has of them. And he appreciates this. But he tells them that he tries not to carry a picture at all. He tries to let each meeting be its own beginning. Because he has learned, over many years, that the picture he carries of a person is never the whole truth. It is one glimpse, from one angle, in one moment, and the person has moved on since then. She has grown, or struggled, or changed in ways he cannot predict. To hold the old picture tightly is to miss who she has become. This is not a technique. It is a form of respect. It says, "You are not the fixed image I have built of you. You are alive. You are changing. And I want to meet you as you are, not as I have decided you must be." And it is not easy. Our minds are built to categorize, to predict, to sort people into known patterns so that we can move through the world efficiently. The Zen teachers understood this. They did not suggest that we could simply stop the mind from doing what it does. But they did suggest that we could notice when it was happening. And in the noticing, something opens. We notice that we have already decided what our partner will say at dinner tonight. And in noticing, we become curious instead. We wonder what she will actually say. We notice that we have already decided what our friend is feeling today. And in noticing, we look more carefully. We see his face as it actually is this morning, not as we assumed it would be. Let us explore a story about this kind of seeing. A Zen teacher once took on a new student, a young woman who had come to the monastery after many years of studying Buddhism on her own. She was intelligent and well-read, and she had strong ideas about what Zen practice should look like. On her first morning, the teacher asked her to sit in the garden and simply watch the birds. "Watch them," the teacher said, "and tell me what you see." The student sat in the garden for an hour. When she came back, she had a great deal to say. She described the species of each bird. She spoke about their migration patterns. She explained the evolutionary purpose of their songs. She had a theory about why certain birds preferred certain trees. The teacher listened and then said, "You have told me many things about birds, but you have not told me about these birds, the ones in this garden. This morning, go back and watch again." The student returned to the garden, confused. She sat for another hour. This time she tried to see the actual birds, not her ideas about them. She watched one bird hop along a branch. She noticed the particular way it tilted its head. She noticed that its feathers were slightly ruffled on one side. She noticed that it sang 3 notes, paused, and then sang 2 different notes, and that this pattern was unlike anything she had read about. When she came back, she said less. But what she said was more alive. "I saw a bird with ruffled feathers," she said. "I think it was cold. It kept looking toward the kitchen door, where the warmth comes out. And there was another one, on the lowest branch, that kept turning its head to watch me. It watched me for a long time. I think it was curious about me." The teacher nodded. "Now you are seeing," she said. "Before, you were looking through a book. Now you are looking through your own eyes." The student sat with this for a moment. "But Master," she said, "is my knowledge of birds worthless then?" "Not at all," the teacher said. "But knowledge is a servant, not a master. When you meet a bird, meet the bird first. Let your knowledge wait at the door. It can come in later, if it is needed. But if it enters first, it will stand between you and the bird, and you will see the knowledge instead of the creature." The student understood, and in the weeks that followed, she began to apply this not only to birds, but to the people around her. She found it more difficult and more rewarding than she expected. The student, with all her knowledge of birds, had been doing exactly what the young man in the kitchen had done with his friend. She had been seeing her ideas instead of seeing what was there. And this is what the Buddhist tradition invites us to consider, not just about birds or trees or mountains, but about the people closest to us, about the ones we are most certain we know. There is a particular kind of courage in this. Because to admit that we do not know who someone is, even someone we love, even someone we have lived with for 20 years, is to let go of something comfortable. It is to step out of the warm house of our certainty and stand in the open air, where we might learn something unexpected, where the person in front of us might turn out to be someone we have never fully seen. But the Zen tradition tells us that this open air, uncomfortable as it may feel at first, is where real intimacy lives. Not in the knowing, not in the certainty, not in the comfortable old portrait we carry around, but in the willingness to look again, to look freshly, to say with honesty, "I do not know who you are right now. Show me." The young man in the monastery kitchen carried what happened that morning with him for a long time. He began to notice how often he made assumptions about the people around him. How often he walked into a room already knowing what everyone was feeling, what everyone needed, who everyone was, and how rarely he was right. He began to experiment with something that felt strange at first. When he saw someone he knew, before speaking, he would take one breath, just one, and in that breath, he would let his assumptions fall away, just enough to actually look at the person in front of him, to see their face as it was today, to notice something he might otherwise have missed. Sometimes he noticed nothing new. The person was, more or less, as he expected, but sometimes, in that single breath of attention, he saw something he would have walked right past. A heaviness in someone's eyes. A brightness that had not been there yesterday. A restlessness, or a calm, or a sadness so private that it was visible only to someone who was truly looking. He found that this one breath of attention changed not only what he saw, but how the other person responded to him. When he met someone with his old assumptions, the conversation stayed on the surface. It followed the familiar grooves. But when he met someone with fresh eyes, even for a moment, something different happened. The other person seemed to sense it. The conversation went deeper. The silences were more comfortable. Something real passed between them, something that had been blocked before by the weight of his certainty. He began to understand, in his own way, what the Buddhist teachers had been pointing to for centuries. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a teaching that says every person we encounter is carrying an entire world inside them. A world of memories and hopes and worries and joys that we will never fully see. The Zen master who meets each student fresh is not performing a trick of attention. He is honoring this truth. He is saying, through his presence, I know that I do not know your world. And because I know that, I will look at you with care. Not knowing, in this way, becomes a form of tenderness. A way of being with people that lets them be who they are, not who we have decided they are. And in that space, something unexpected often happens. People relax. They open. They show us parts of themselves they had been keeping hidden, because they can feel that we are not looking at them through the lens of our old ideas. We are simply looking, and being looked at in this way, without judgment, without the weight of someone else's fixed opinion, is one of the kindest things another person can offer us. The Zen tradition does not ask us to forget the people we love. It does not ask us to pretend we have no history, no memories, no shared past. It asks us only to hold all of that loosely enough that we can see what is actually in front of us. To carry our knowing like an open hand rather than a closed fist. To remember that the person standing before us is always, in some way, a stranger. And that this is not a loss. It is a gift. It is the gift of a world that is always becoming new, if only we are willing to see it. Let us pause here. Feel whatever is present. There is nowhere else to be. And when you are ready, we will continue together. If you were to sit in a crowded room right now and look around at the faces, what would you see? You would see ordinary people. A woman adjusting her sleeve. A man looking out the window. Someone checking the time. Someone yawning. Someone sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make you stop and look twice. Just people. The kind of people you pass every day and think nothing of. But if each of those people were to stand up, one by one, and tell you the truth of what they were carrying inside, you would be astonished. There is a story about a young man who had spent several years living in a Buddhist monastery, far from any city, far from the ordinary rhythms of the world. He had entered the monastery as a young person and had given himself entirely to the life there. Meditation, study, work in the gardens and the kitchen. The days were measured by bells and silence and the slow turning of the seasons. When he finally left the monastery and returned to the wider world, everything felt unfamiliar. The noise of traffic, the speed at which people moved, the crowded markets and the faces of strangers. He had grown used to a life measured in bells and silence, where he knew everyone by name and everyone knew him. Out here, the world was full of people he had never met, living lives he knew nothing about. In the monastery, suffering had been something he studied in the ancient texts. The Buddha's first teaching, the truth of suffering, had been something he turned over in his mind during meditation, something he understood in theory. But out here, beyond the monastery walls, suffering was not a concept. It was everywhere. It was in the faces of the people around him, if only he knew how to look. Not long after his return, he attended a gathering. It was a weekend event where people came together to sit in a circle and speak honestly about their lives. He had heard about these gatherings and was curious. He did not know what to expect. The room was plain. Chairs arranged in a circle. A window letting in the late afternoon light. Perhaps 20 or 30 people had come, and they were, as far as he could tell, entirely ordinary. The kind of people you might see at a market or walking along a river path. He sat down among them and waited. A kind voice welcomed the group and invited anyone who wished to speak. There was no pressure, the voice said. No one had to share anything they did not want to share. But if they felt moved to speak, the room was here to listen. For a long moment, no one said anything. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when a group of strangers is finding its footing, settling into a shared space, learning to breathe together. And then, one by one, the ordinary people began to talk. A woman near the window spoke first. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a face that looked, at first glance, like the face of someone who had lived a comfortable life. She spoke about her son, who had been ill for a long time. She spoke about sitting beside his bed through the long nights, reading to him, holding his hand when he was too tired to speak. She spoke about the mornings when she would drive home and sit in her car in the driveway, unable to go inside, because going inside meant returning to the house where everything reminded her of how things used to be. She said all of this very simply, without drama, without asking for anything. She was just telling the truth of her days, and the room held her words with great care. Then a man across the circle spoke. He was younger, perhaps in his 30s, with the look of someone who spent his days working outdoors. He spoke about his father, who had grown old and whose memory was fading. He described visiting his father each week and watching the recognition in his father's eyes grow dimmer each time. He said that last week, for the first time, his father had looked at him and asked who he was. He paused after he said this. He did not cry. He simply sat with it, and the room sat with him. A third person spoke, a man about the same age, who said that he had recently gone through a separation from his wife. They had been together for many years. He said that what surprised him most was not the sadness, which he had expected, but the loneliness that came in the ordinary moments. Making coffee in the morning for one instead of two. Coming home to a house that was the same house but did not feel the same at all. Then a woman, who had been very still through all of this, sitting with her hands in her lap, began to speak. She said that she had come to the gathering because she had recently been told that she herself was unwell. She did not go into detail. She said only that the world looked different to her now. Colors were brighter. Food tasted more vivid. The sound of the wind in the trees outside her window had become, somehow, the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. I do not know how much time I have, she said, but I have never been so awake. The young man who had come from the monastery sat through all of this in a state of quiet amazement. He had lived for years in a place devoted to understanding the human heart, and yet he realized, listening to these people, that he had understood very little about the lives being lived all around him. These were the people he would have passed on the street without a second thought. The woman with the silver hair could have been anyone in a crowd. The man who worked outdoors was the kind of person he might have nodded to and walked on by. The woman with her hands in her lap could have been sitting beside him on any bench in any park, and he would not have known that she was carrying something so vast inside her. He had been living, he realized, inside a kind of assumption. The assumption that ordinary means simple, that the people around us, the ones who do not stand out, who do not announce their depth, are somehow less complex, less rich, less full of life than we imagine ourselves to be. That evening, walking home from the gathering, the world looked different to him. Not because anything had changed, but because he was seeing, for the first time, what had always been there. Every person he passed on the street was carrying an entire life. A life full of love and loss and hope and worry and courage and tenderness. A life as deep and as real as his own. The woman walking her dog on the far side of the road. What was she carrying? The young couple sitting on a bench, not speaking, looking out at the water. What lived between them that he could not see? The old man who nodded to him as he passed. What had his mornings been like? What had his years been like? He did not know. He could not know. And for the first time, that not knowing did not feel like ignorance. It felt like respect. He had just never looked closely enough to see it. The Buddha spoke often about compassion. He called it one of the highest qualities a person could develop. He said that a heart filled with compassion is like a mother's love for her only child, extended without boundary to every living being. But how do we feel compassion for a stranger? How do we open our hearts to someone whose name we do not know, whose story we have never heard, whose face we will forget by tomorrow? Most of us wait to feel compassion until we have a reason, until we hear the story, until we see the tears, until we learn what someone is going through. And then, moved by what we have heard, we feel something open in us. We feel for them. We wish them well. But the Buddhist tradition suggests something different. It suggests that compassion can come before the story, that it can begin with exactly the kind of not knowing we have been exploring throughout this evening. When we admit that we do not know what someone is carrying, when we let go of our assumption that we can see everything about a person in a single glance, something opens in us. Not pity, which looks down. Not sympathy, which stays at a safe distance. Something deeper and more honest than either of those. A kind of reverence for the mystery of another life. There is a Buddhist teaching that says, if you could truly see the full story of any person you pass on the street, your heart would break with tenderness. Not because every life is tragic. Many lives are full of joy and beauty and satisfaction, but because every life is so much more than it appears. Every person is carrying so much more than their face reveals. Joy and sorrow, hope and weariness, kindness given and kindness received, all woven together in a pattern that no one else will ever fully see. The Zen tradition calls this meeting someone face to face, and they do not mean it casually. To meet someone face to face, in the Zen sense, is to meet them without your assumptions, without your categories, without your ideas about who they are or what they deserve or how important they might be. It is to stand before another human being and simply acknowledge, I do not know your life. I do not know your heart. And because I do not know, I will meet you with care. Let us explore a story about a Zen teacher and a visitor. A wealthy merchant once traveled to a famous monastery to seek counsel from the teacher there. He arrived in fine clothes, with servants carrying his bags, and he was received with the courtesy that any visitor to a monastery would receive. Over dinner that evening, the merchant noticed that the teacher treated him with exactly the same warmth and attention that she showed to the cook who brought the food, to the young student who swept the floor, and to an old wanderer who had arrived at the gate that afternoon with nothing but the clothes on his back. This bothered the merchant. He had traveled a great distance. He was a man of importance, and he was being treated no differently from a cook and a beggar. After the meal, he said to the teacher, "Master, forgive me, but do you not make distinctions between your guests? I have come a long way, and at great expense. Should I not be received differently from a man who wandered in from the road?" The teacher looked at him with steady eyes. "You are both carrying something precious," she said. "You are both carrying a life you do not fully understand. In that, you are equal, and I am equal to both of you." The merchant did not know what to say. He had expected the teacher to recognize his status, his accomplishments, his wealth. Instead, she had recognized something he had never thought to value. Something that the wanderer at the gate possessed in exactly the same measure as he did. He stayed at the monastery for 3 more days. And during those days, he began to look at the people around him differently. The cook, the sweeper, the wanderer. He sat beside them at meals. He listened when they spoke, and he began to sense, beneath the surface of each of them, the same depth that he had always assumed was his alone. The cook had buried 2 children. The sweeper had once been a scholar before his eyesight failed. The wanderer had walked across an entire country, and the stories he carried could have filled a library. None of them wore their depth on the outside. None of them announced it. It was simply there, as it is in every person, waiting for someone to look carefully enough to notice. When the merchant left, he bowed to the teacher and said, "I came here thinking I was someone important. I am leaving knowing that everyone is." The teacher smiled. "That," she said, "is the beginning." This is what the Buddhist tradition has been pointing to for more than 2,000 years. That every person we encounter, without exception, is carrying something we cannot see. And that the wisest response to this truth is not to try to guess what they are carrying. It is simply to know that we do not know, and to let that not knowing shape how we meet them. Not with suspicion, not with pity, not with a kind of exaggerated sensitivity that makes other people uncomfortable, but with a basic, steady respect for the fact that every life is deeper than it appears. The young man from the monastery carried what he learned at that gathering with him for the rest of his life. He never forgot the silver-haired woman, or the man whose father was forgetting him, or the woman who said the wind had never sounded so beautiful. He never forgot the lesson they taught him without trying to teach him anything at all. Everyone is carrying something, and most of the time we cannot see it, but we can know that it is there. And that knowing, that simple, honest acknowledgement of what we cannot see, is perhaps the most compassionate thing we can offer another person. It costs nothing. It requires no special skill. It asks nothing of us except a willingness to walk through the world with our eyes a little more open, and our certainty a little more loosened, and our hearts a little more willing to be surprised by the depth of the person standing right in front of us. The next time you are in a crowded room or a busy street, or standing in a line beside someone you have never met, you might remember this. You do not know their story. You do not know what they have come through, or what they are facing, or what keeps them awake at night, or what makes them laugh when no one is watching. But you know that their story exists, and that it is as real, and as full, and as important as your own. That is enough. That is already compassion. Take a breath here. Let whatever has moved in you settle. There is no rush, and when you are ready, we will go on together. There is a Zen saying, "The fish does not know it is in water." It is such a simple image. A fish swimming through its life, surrounded on every side by water, and yet entirely unaware of it. The water is so constant, so total, so ever-present, that the fish has never once had reason to notice it. It has never known anything else. The Zen teachers use this image to describe something about the human mind. We swim every day through a sea of beliefs. Beliefs about who we are. Beliefs about what other people think of us. Beliefs about what we need, what we deserve, what is expected of us, what will happen if we fail. These beliefs are so familiar, so deeply woven into our thinking, that we do not even recognize them as beliefs. They feel like facts. They feel like the way things simply are. But they are not facts. They are the water we swim in. And until we learn to notice them, they shape everything we do. Let us explore a story about a young Buddhist monk who was given charge of the kitchen at his monastery. It was meant to be an honor. The head teacher had chosen him because he was hard-working and capable. The kitchen at this monastery fed a community of 40 or 50 people 3 times a day, and running it required planning, coordination, and the ability to work well with others. The young monk threw himself into the job. He woke before dawn to start the fires. He planned the meals carefully, trying to balance what was available with what the community would enjoy. He organized the supplies. He worked alongside a crew of other monks and volunteers, and he did his best to keep everything running smoothly. But something was wrong, something he could not quite name. He felt tense all the time. His shoulders ached. His jaw was tight. His sleep was restless. Every decision, no matter how ordinary, seemed to carry a weight that did not belong to it. Should he prepare rice or noodles? What if the others preferred rice and he had chosen wrong? Should he ask the new volunteer to chop the vegetables differently? What if she was offended and told the others he was difficult to work with? Should he say something to the monk who kept arriving late, or would that make him seem harsh and unkind? Every interaction felt loaded. Every choice felt like a test he might fail. And beneath it all, there was a steady hum of anxiety that followed him from the first bell of morning to the last bell of night, like a sound so constant he had stopped hearing it. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he sat down alone in the empty kitchen. The pots were clean. The fires were banked. The room was still, and in that stillness, something surfaced. He realized, with a clarity that surprised him, what was driving all of it. Not the workload, not the responsibility, not even the other people and their various moods and complaints. It was a belief, one belief running underneath everything like a river running beneath a road. And the belief was this: it is important that everyone likes me. That was it. That was the water he had been swimming in. Not just in the kitchen, in his whole life. He could trace it back as far as he could remember. As a child, he had been the one who smoothed things over when his parents argued. As a student, he had been the one who agreed with everyone, even when he did not agree, because disagreeing meant risking someone's disapproval. As a friend, he had been the one who always said yes, who always helped, who always put his own needs last, because somewhere deep down, he believed that if he ever said no, if he ever disappointed anyone, something terrible would happen. He would be rejected. He would be alone. He would be, in some final and irreversible way, unloved. He had never chosen this belief. He had never sat down and decided, I believe that everyone must like me. It had simply grown in him, the way moss grows on a stone, so gradually and so thoroughly that he could no longer tell where the stone ended and the moss began. And now, in the monastery kitchen, surrounded by people he was supposed to lead, this belief was making him miserable. Because you cannot lead a kitchen and please everyone. You cannot make 40 different people happy with the same meal. You cannot avoid every conflict and still do the work that needs to be done. The belief that everyone should like him was at war with the reality of his life, and the belief was winning. The Buddha had a great deal to say about beliefs. He called them formations, or sometimes fabrications, and he considered them one of the most powerful forces in the human mind. Not because beliefs are inherently bad. Some beliefs are useful and true, but because most of our beliefs are invisible to us, they operate beneath the surface of our thinking, shaping our emotions and our actions without our knowledge or consent. The Buddha compared these hidden beliefs to the roots of a tree. You can see the trunk. You can see the branches. You can see the leaves. But what you cannot see, hidden beneath the dark earth, is the root system that holds the whole thing up. And if the roots are tangled, if they are wrapped around stones and old debris, the tree above will show it. The branches will be crooked. The leaves will wilt. And no amount of tending to the leaves will fix a problem that lives in the roots. Our daily anxieties are like those wilting leaves. We notice them. We worry about them. We try to fix them one by one. We try to manage our stress. We try to calm our worries. We try to be less reactive, less tense, less afraid. And sometimes, for a day or a week, it works. We feel better. The leaves perk up. But then, almost always, the same old anxiety returns. The same old tightness. The same old worry. Because the root has not been touched. The root is the belief. And until we look at it, name it, and meet it honestly, the anxiety will keep sending up new leaves, no matter how many we pluck. The young monk in the kitchen did not solve his problem overnight, but recognizing the belief was the beginning of something important. He began to notice it everywhere, not just in the kitchen, but in every part of his life at the monastery. When he walked into the meditation hall, he noticed the thought, are they watching me? Do they think I am sitting properly? Beneath that thought, the belief, it is important that people approve of me. When he spoke during community meetings, He noticed himself editing his words, softening his opinions, holding back what he actually wanted to say. Beneath that, if I say the wrong thing, they will not like me. When he passed another monk in the corridor and received no greeting, he noticed a flash of worry. Beneath that, he must be upset with me. I must have done something wrong. Each time, the same invisible belief, running the show from underneath. It was exhausting to see how thoroughly it had arranged his life. His posture, his tone of voice, his laughter, even his silences had all been shaped by this one unexamined belief. He had been performing, without knowing it, for an audience he could never satisfy. And then he began to do something that changed his life. He began to answer the belief with 3 words. I don't know. It is important that everyone likes me. I don't know if that is true. If I say the wrong thing, something terrible will happen. I don't know if that is true. If someone is upset, it must be my fault. I don't know if that is true. This is one of the simplest and most powerful things the Zen tradition has to offer. Not a technique. Exactly. More like a key that fits a lock you did not know was there. When a thought arises, a worried thought, an anxious thought, a thought that tightens the chest and speeds the breath, instead of believing it immediately, instead of following it down its familiar path, you meet it with those 3 words. I don't know. You do not argue with the thought. You do not try to replace it with a better thought. You simply decline to accept it as fact. You open a gap, a moment of space, a breath of fresh air in a room that has been closed for a long time. I need to impress these people. I don't know. This situation is going to go badly. I don't know. I am not good enough for this. I don't know. Each time, the phrase does the same thing. It loosens the grip. Not violently, not through force, just by introducing a moment of honest uncertainty where before there was only the hard surface of conviction. The Zen teachers understood that most of our suffering does not come from what is actually happening to us. It comes from our beliefs about what is happening to us. The situation itself is often bearable. What makes it unbearable is the story we tell ourselves about it. And the story rests, always, on a belief we have never questioned. Let us look at this a little more closely. There is a teaching that is sometimes attributed to the Buddhist tradition, and it goes something like this. The thought I need to make a certain meal for my guest this evening seems harmless enough. It is just a plan, just a practical decision about dinner. But beneath that thought, if you look carefully, there is often another thought. I need to impress my guests. And beneath that, another. I need to be seen as someone who is capable and generous. And beneath that, still another. If people do not see me as capable and generous, something is wrong with me. And beneath that, at the very bottom, the deepest belief of all, I am not enough as I am. All of this, running beneath a decision about dinner. Layer after layer of belief, stacked so tightly that we never think to pull them apart. And each layer, when met with the question, I don't know if that is true, loosens just a little. Do I need to impress my guests? I don't know. Maybe I do. Maybe I don't. Do I need to be seen as capable? I don't know. Is something wrong with me if people are not impressed? I don't know. Who told me that? Where did that idea come from? Am I not enough as I am? I don't know. But I notice that when I sit with that question, Instead of running from it, the world does not end. The ground does not open. I am still here, still breathing, and something in my chest, something that has been clenched for as long as I can remember, begins to ease. The young monk in the kitchen did not become a different person. He did not stop caring what people thought. The belief that lived beneath his days did not vanish. Beliefs like that do not disappear overnight. They have roots that go deep, and they have been with us for a long time. But it loosened. It became something he could see, rather than something that was seeing for him. And that made all the difference. He began to lead the kitchen differently. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, but more honestly. He said what needed to be said, even when he was afraid it might not be well received. He made decisions based on what the situation required, rather than on what would make everyone comfortable. When a conflict arose, he addressed it directly, instead of bending himself into knots trying to make sure no one was upset. And he discovered something that surprised him. The people around him did not like him less for this. In fact, many of them seemed to trust him more. One of the monks he had been most afraid of upsetting came to him one evening and said, simply, "You have become easier to work with." The monk meant it as a compliment, and the young man understood, with a kind of rueful smile, that all those months of trying so hard to be liked had actually made him harder to be around. His anxiety had been visible to everyone but himself, because honesty, even imperfect honesty, has a quality that people can feel. And the constant anxious performance of trying to be liked, which he had been running for years, was something people could feel too. They had simply been too polite to say so. The Buddha taught that freedom is not the absence of difficulty. It is the ability to meet difficulty without being controlled by our reactions to it. And our reactions, almost always, rest on beliefs. The monk in the kitchen was not freed from the belief that people should like him. He was freed from the belief's authority. He could see it now. He could feel it arise. And he could meet it each time with those three honest words: I don't know. There is a story told in the Zen tradition about a student who went to his teacher in frustration. "I have been practicing I don't know for a month," the student said. "I say it to every thought that arises, and I feel like I am left with nothing. No ground to stand on, no certainty, no beliefs at all. What am I supposed to do with nothing?" The teacher looked at him calmly. "Tell me," she said, "before you started this practice, were your beliefs making you happy?" The student considered this. "No," he said. "Then perhaps," the teacher said, "nothing is an improvement." The student laughed, and in that laughter, something released. He understood, not with his intellect, but with his whole body, that the emptiness he feared was not emptiness at all. It was space, room to breathe, room to move, room to respond to life as it actually was, rather than as his beliefs insisted it must be. He had been so full of certainty for so long that he had forgotten what space felt like. And now, standing in it, he found that it was not frightening at all. It was a relief, like setting down a heavy bag you have been carrying so long that your arms had forgotten they were tired. The Zen masters call this spaciousness. The Buddha called it liberation. It does not mean having no thoughts and no beliefs. It means holding them so lightly that they no longer hold us. And it begins, always, with the willingness to meet what we believe with honesty. To look at the thought that is driving our anxiety, the one that feels so true, so certain, so obviously right, and to say, with kindness and without aggression, I don't know if that is true, and to see what happens in the space that opens. Let us rest here for a moment. Notice what you are feeling. There is nothing you need to decide. And when you are ready, we will continue together. Have you ever held someone's hand and for a moment you were not thinking about anything at all? Not thinking about what to say next? Not thinking about what happened earlier in the day? Not thinking about tomorrow? Just holding a hand? Just feeling the warmth of it? Just being there in that one moment with nothing between you and the person beside you? If you have, then you already know something about what the Zen masters were pointing to when they spoke about not knowing mind. Because in that moment, when thought falls away and there is just presence, just contact, just the feeling of being alive alongside another person, something comes very close. Closer than words can reach. Closer than ideas can travel. And it comes close precisely because you are not trying to understand it, or name it, or figure it out. You are simply in it. The Zen tradition has a word for this closeness. They call it intimacy, and they consider it one of the deepest things a human being can experience. There is a story treasured in the Zen tradition for many centuries about a monk who had been living at a monastery for some time. He had come to the monastery as a wanderer. In those days, it was common for Buddhist monks to travel from temple to temple, spending a season here and a season there, learning from different teachers and walking the open road between. It was considered a form of practice in itself, this wandering. The road was the teacher. The weather was the teacher. The stranger met at the crossroads was the teacher. Everything encountered along the way was an invitation to be present. This particular monk had stayed longer than he had planned. The monastery had been good to him. The teacher there had been patient and kind, and the monk had learned much during his stay. He had sat through long winter meditation retreats, his legs aching, his mind restless, and then, over time, growing clearer. He had studied the old Buddhist texts by lamplight. He had worked in the gardens and the kitchen. He had argued with other monks about the meaning of the teachings and had sometimes been wrong and had sometimes been right and had learned, slowly, that neither mattered as much as he had thought. But now the time had come to move on. The road was calling him again, as it always did. There was something in him that needed to keep walking, not away from anything, but towards something he could not yet name. And the teacher, who understood this, did not try to keep him. On the morning of his departure, the teacher walked with him to the gate. The air was cool. The light was just beginning to come through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the morning bell was ringing in another monastery across the valley. Their footsteps sounded together on the stone path, and neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing that needed to be said. Everything that mattered had already been exchanged in the months of shared practice, shared meals, shared silence. At the gate, the teacher stopped and turned to his student. He looked at the young monk's face, at the bundle over his shoulder, at the road winding down into the valley below. "So," the teacher said, You are going wandering again. Yes, the monk said. And how will you wander? How will you be as you walk the road? The monk considered the question. He could have said many things. He could have spoken about mindfulness, or about the precepts, or about the teachings he had studied. He could have recited what he had learned. He could have offered a philosophy. Instead, he said something very simple. I don't know. The teacher looked at him, and then the teacher said 5 words that have echoed through the Zen tradition ever since. Not knowing is most intimate. Not knowing is most intimate. Let those words rest for a moment. There is no need to figure them out right away. Let them sit like a stone dropped into deep water and see what ripples come. What could the teacher have meant? How can not knowing be intimate? We tend to think of intimacy as something that comes from knowing a person well, knowing their history, knowing their habits, knowing what makes them laugh and what makes them cry. The more we know someone, we believe, the closer we are to them. And there is truth in that. Shared history matters. Shared experience matters. But the Zen tradition is pointing to something else. Something that happens beneath all the knowing. Something that happens when, for just a moment, the knowing falls away. Think about the moments in your life when you have felt closest to someone. Not the moments when you had the best conversation, or the most interesting discussion, or the deepest intellectual connection. The moments when you felt closest. Sitting beside someone you love, watching the evening come in. Neither of you speaking. Neither of you needing to speak. Just being there, together, in the fading light. The mind, for once, is not working. It is not analyzing the relationship. It is not planning what to say next. It is not comparing this evening to other evenings. It is simply here. And in that simplicity, the other person feels closer than they have ever been. Or the moment you first held a newborn child. You did not know this person at all. You knew nothing about who they would become, what they would love, what their voice would sound like, what would make them laugh. You knew nothing, and yet you have perhaps never felt so close to another being in your life. Because there was nothing between you. No history, no expectations, no ideas about who this person should be. Just a warm, breathing, astonishing presence in your arms, and a heart so full it could barely hold itself together. Or standing outside on a clear night, looking up at the stars. In that moment, if it is a real moment, there is no knowing at all. There is no name for what you are feeling. There is no category it fits into. There is just the darkness and the light and the immensity of it, and you, standing in it, wordless. And in that wordlessness, the distance between you and the sky seems to disappear. You are not looking at the stars from far away. You are, for just a moment, part of the same thing they are part of. In each of these moments, what has dropped away is the thinking mind, the labeling mind, the mind that knows and sorts and compares and judges. And what remains, when that mind grows still, is a kind of closeness to experience that nothing else can provide. That is what the Zen teacher meant. Not knowing is most intimate. When we stop standing at a distance from life, holding it at arm's length with our concepts and opinions and ideas about how it should be, and when we step forward into the raw, unnamed, uninterpreted experience of being alive, we come closer to life than knowing can ever bring us. There is another story from the Zen tradition that touches on this same truth from a different direction. Two monks had sat side by side in the meditation hall every morning for nearly 20 years. They were friends, in the way that people who share a life of practice become friends. They knew each other's habits. They knew the sound of each other's breathing. They knew which one would cough during the long winter sittings and which one's knees would crack when he stood. They had shared thousands of meals, thousands of silences, thousands of mornings, watching the same light come through the same window onto the same wooden floor. They knew each other well, or so they believed. One morning, during the early sitting, the younger of the two began to weep. He did not make a sound. He did not move. He simply sat on his cushion, upright, eyes closed, while tears ran down his face and fell onto his folded hands. The older monk, sitting beside him, noticed. He felt the shift in his friend's breathing. He sensed, without looking, that something was happening, and his first impulse was to understand, to reach for an explanation. Had something happened? Was he thinking about his mother, who had been unwell? Had he received bad news? The mind leaped to its usual work, sorting through possibilities, trying to know. But something stopped him. Something he had been learning over those 20 years of sitting about the difference between understanding a person and being with a person. He did not try to know what was happening. He did not lean over and whisper a question. He did not offer comfort or advice or even a look of sympathy. He simply sat. He breathed. He remained exactly where he was, exactly as he was, beside his friend, with no idea what was going on and no plan for what to do about it. And in that not knowing, something remarkable happened. The space between them, which had always been full of familiarity and history and easy understanding, became something else. It became open. It became alive. It became, in a way that neither of them could have described, more real than 20 years of friendship had been. The older monk felt it. His friend was not the person he had known for 2 decades. He was someone he had never met before. A person in the grip of something invisible and private, something that could not be named or explained or fixed. And sitting beside that mystery, without trying to solve it, was the closest he had ever felt to another human being. When the bell rang and the sitting ended, the younger monk wiped his face and stood. He looked at his friend. He did not explain. He did not need to. Something had passed between them in that silence that was deeper than any explanation could have reached. Years later, the older monk would tell his students about that morning. He would say that in all his years of practice, all his study of the Buddhist teachings, all his conversations about wisdom and compassion and the nature of the mind, that 1 hour of sitting beside someone in complete not knowing had taught him more about intimacy than everything else combined. What happened between those two monks is something the Zen tradition has pointed to for centuries. When we stop trying to understand another person, when we stop reaching for our familiar categories and explanations, something else becomes possible. A kind of presence that is not about knowing but about being with. The Buddhist tradition has many words for this kind of presence. Some teachers call it suchness, the plain, just this, of a moment, experienced without commentary. Some call it being with what is. But perhaps the simplest way to say it is this: when we stop knowing, we start being. And being, it turns out, is closer to life than knowing ever was. This does not mean that knowing is bad. The Zen masters were not against knowledge. Many of them were brilliant scholars, deeply versed in the Buddhist scriptures, capable of intricate philosophical debate. They valued learning. They valued study. They valued the hard-won understanding that comes from years of practice and reflection. But they understood that knowledge, for all its value, creates a certain distance. Every label we place on an experience puts a thin layer between us and the experience itself. Every concept we wrap around a moment adds a film of separation. And over time, if we are not careful, we find ourselves surrounded by our ideas about life, rather than by life itself. We know everything about love but have stopped feeling it. We know everything about beauty but walk past it without pausing. We know everything about the present moment but are always somewhere else in our minds. Not knowing mind dissolves that distance, not permanently, not through force, but in moments, in breaths, in the gap between one thought and the next, when the mind rests and the world comes flooding in, vivid and intimate. The monk who stood at the gate that morning, answering his teacher's question with, "I don't know," was not being humble. He was not being clever. He was not trying to impress the teacher with a spiritual performance. He was telling the truth. He did not know how he would be on the road. He did not know what he would encounter, or how he would respond, or what the journey would ask of him. And in admitting this, in standing in that honest uncertainty, something opened between him and the world he was about to enter. He did not walk into the road with a plan. He walked into it with an open heart. And the teacher, recognizing this, named what he saw. Not knowing is most intimate. This young man, by not knowing, had made himself available to whatever the road would bring. He had removed the barrier between himself and whatever came next. There is a teaching attributed to the Buddha that says, "In the seen, let there be just the seen. In the heard, just the heard. In the felt, just the felt." This is perhaps the simplest instruction in all of Buddhism, and it is pointing to the same thing the Zen teacher pointed to at the gate. Let experience be experience. Do not add to it. Do not wrap it in stories. Do not stand at a distance from it with your clipboard of categories. Just let it in. Just let it be what it is. And notice how close it comes when you do. The rain on the roof, the hand in yours, the stars above, the road ahead. Each of these, when met without the interference of knowing, becomes more vivid, more alive, more present than any amount of knowledge could make it. Not knowing is not a loss. It is a homecoming. It is a return to the world as it is before we covered it with our opinions. A return to the people we love before we replaced them with our ideas about them. A return to our own lives before we buried them under plans and worries and the endless narration of the thinking mind. The Zen tradition has carried this teaching forward for more than 1,000 years, and it endures because it touches something that every person recognizes. We have all tasted it. We have all had those moments when the mind rested and the world came close. The teaching simply says, those moments are not accidents. They are glimpses of how things always are, beneath the veil. And they are available to us whenever we are willing to set down our knowing, even for a breath, and let life meet us where we stand. Let us rest here with this. There is nothing to understand, nothing to figure out, just this breath, just this moment. And when you are ready, we will continue together. By now, you might be wondering something. After all this talk of not knowing, after all these stories of letting go of certainty and setting down our opinions and meeting the world without our fixed ideas, you might be asking a reasonable question. Does this mean I have to forget everything I have learned? It is a fair question. And the answer, given by one of the most beloved Zen teachers of the last century, is both simple and reassuring. He said, "Not knowing does not mean you do not know." Let that land for a moment. Not knowing does not mean you do not know. You still know how to cook a meal. You still know the names of your children. You still know the way home. You still know what you have learned through years of living and working and loving and making mistakes. None of that is taken away. Not knowing mind does not ask you to become a blank page. It does not ask you to pretend you have no experience, no memory, no wisdom of your own. What it asks is something more subtle than that. It asks you to hold what you know lightly. There is an image that has been used by Buddhist teachers for a long time, and it captures this beautifully. Imagine you are holding a bird in your cupped hands. A living bird, warm and trembling, with its heart beating against your palms. If you grip too tightly, you will crush it. The very thing you are trying to hold will be destroyed by the force of your holding. But if you open your hands completely, the bird will fly away. You will have nothing at all. The art is in the middle. Hands cupped, firm enough to hold, open enough to let the bird breathe, open enough to let it move, open enough that, if the moment comes for the bird to fly, your hands will not prevent it. This is how the Zen tradition invites us to hold our knowledge, our beliefs, our plans, and our ideas about how life should be. Not with a death grip, not with the iron certainty that says, I know exactly what is happening, and I know exactly what should happen next. But also, not with empty hands and an empty head. Somewhere in between, somewhere in the space between grasping and letting go, there is a way of holding that is alive, a way of carrying what we know without being carried away by it. The Buddha spoke about this as the middle way, not the extreme of clinging and not the extreme of rejection, but the path that runs between them, where life can actually be lived. There is a tradition within Zen Buddhism that took this teaching and turned it into something practical and alive. A Zen teacher, deeply committed to bringing Buddhist wisdom into the troubles of the world, founded what he called a peacemaker community. And at the heart of this community, he placed 3 principles, 3 movements of the heart that he believed could guide anyone in any situation toward a wiser and more compassionate response. The first principle was not knowing, entering every situation without a fixed idea of what is needed, arriving fresh, arriving open, arriving without the assumption that we already have the answer. This is where it begins, always, with the willingness to say, I do not yet know what is needed here. Let me look. Let me listen. Let me find out. The second principle was bearing witness. Once we have set aside our fixed ideas, we simply look. We see what is actually here. We listen to what is actually being said. We feel what is actually present in this room, this conversation, this moment. We do not rush to fix anything. We do not rush to offer our advice or our solutions. We simply witness, with full attention and full presence, what is in front of us. And in that witnessing, something remarkable happens. the situation begins to reveal itself. It begins to show us what it needs, not what we assumed it needed, but what it actually needs. And this is almost always different from what we expected. And the third principle was healing. From the ground of not knowing, and from the clear seeing of bearing witness, something arises naturally. Not a plan we have imposed on the situation from the outside, but a response that grows out of the situation itself. A word of kindness, an act of service, a hand extended at the right moment, or sometimes simply a willingness to be present with someone in their difficulty without trying to make it go away. Because sometimes what heals us is not a solution. It is the knowledge that someone is here, someone is paying attention, someone has seen us as we are. Not knowing, bearing witness, healing. 3 movements, unfolding one from the other, like a flower opening in the morning. And each one depends on the one before it. Without not knowing, we cannot truly witness. And without witnessing, we cannot truly heal. The order matters. The patience matters. The willingness to slow down, to resist the urge to leap ahead to the fixing, matters. Let us explore a story about how these 3 movements might look in an ordinary life. Imagine someone you care about comes to you one evening. She sits down across from you, and you can see that something is weighing on her. Her eyes are tired. Her voice is flat. She says, "I am struggling." Now, the mind's first impulse, almost always, is to know, to diagnose, to figure out what is wrong and offer a solution. We have known this person for a long time. We think we understand her patterns. We have ideas about what she should do. And so we leap in. "Have you tried this? What about that? I think the problem is." But imagine, just for a moment, that you pause. You set aside what you think you know. You enter the conversation with the first principle, not knowing. You do not assume you understand what she is going through. You do not assume you know what she needs. You simply arrive, open and attentive, without a script. Then you move to the second principle, bearing witness. You look at her, really look at her. You see the tiredness around her eyes. You hear the particular tone of her voice tonight, which is different from last week, different from last month. You notice that she is holding her cup with both hands, as if she needs the warmth. You notice what is actually here, in this moment, with this person. And then, from that seeing, something arises. Not your advice, not your plan, not your theory about what she should do. Something simpler than that. Maybe you reach across the table and take her hand. Maybe you say, "I am here." Maybe you pour her more tea. Maybe you ask one question, not the question you would have asked before, not the diagnostic question, but something that comes from having actually seen her. What is the hardest part? Maybe you say nothing at all, and the silence between you becomes a kind of holding, a kind of warmth that she can feel. That is the third principle. Healing, not fixing, not solving, just being present in a way that allows something in the other person to breathe. And here is what is remarkable. This kind of response, this response that comes from not knowing and from bearing witness, almost always lands more truly than the advice we would have given. Because it comes from the reality of this moment, not from the theory in our heads. It meets the person where she actually is, not where we assumed she would be. This is the part of not knowing mind that the Zen tradition considers perhaps the most important. It is not a retreat from life. It is not a withdrawal into vagueness or passivity. It is, if anything, a deeper engagement with life, a more honest, more present, more responsive way of being in the world. Because when we let go of our need to control how things turn out, something else becomes possible. We become available to the person in front of us, available to the moment as it actually is, available to a response that we could never have planned, because it could only have come from being here, right now, in this particular situation, with this particular person. A Zen teacher was once asked the difference between controlling a situation and simply being present to it. And she said something that has stayed with many of her students. Control means you have decided how things must go, and you are working to make the world match your decision. Presence means you have decided to be here, fully here, and you are allowing the world to show you what it needs. She went on to say that this is a little like the difference between gripping a rope and holding it. Both involve contact. Both involve engagement. But one is rigid and exhausting, and the other is alive. Think of a parent with a child, she said. You cannot control a child. Anyone who has tried knows this. But you can hold a child. You can set boundaries. You can say, within these bounds, you are free to be who you are. You can say, I will not tell you what to think, but I will be here while you learn to think for yourself. That is not control. That is love. And perhaps the mind itself is a little like this. We cannot control what thoughts arise. We cannot control what feelings come. We cannot prevent the worry, the doubt, the old familiar anxieties from visiting us. But we can hold them. We can set boundaries. We can say, you are welcome here, but you are not in charge. I will listen to you, but I will not be governed by you. And that holding, that loving containment, is very different from the grinding effort of trying to control what the mind does. And so we arrive at something that has been running beneath this entire evening, like a river running beneath a road. Not knowing mind is not about giving up. It is not about becoming passive or indifferent. It is about learning to hold life the way we might hold that bird in our cupped hands. Firmly enough that we are engaged, that we care, that we are present and responsible and real. But lightly enough that life can breathe, that people can surprise us, that the moment can become something we did not expect. The Buddha, in one of his most famous teachings, spoke about two kinds of suffering. The first is the pain that life brings naturally. Loss, change, difficulty, the ache of a body that grows tired, the sadness of parting, the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. These are part of being alive, and no teaching, no philosophy, no amount of wisdom can remove them entirely. They come with the territory of being human. The second kind of suffering is the suffering we add on top. The suffering that comes from wanting things to be different from how they are. From gripping, from insisting, from needing to know and needing to control and needing the world to match the picture we have built in our heads. This is the suffering of resistance, the suffering of arguing with reality, the suffering of saying over and over, this should not be happening, when it is, in fact, happening. The first kind of suffering, the Buddha said, is unavoidable. But the second kind is optional. And the way we begin to loosen it is not through force, not through willpower, not through gritting our teeth and trying harder. It is by learning to hold life as it is, rather than grasping at life as we wish it were. It is by opening the hands, just a little, and letting what is here be here. Not knowing mind is one of the most direct paths to this kind of freedom. Not because it removes difficulty, but because it removes the layer of resistance we place on top of difficulty. It lets us meet what is here without the exhausting insistence that it should be something else. There is one more story told among Zen students that brings this home. A student came to her teacher and said, "I have been practicing not knowing for many months now, and I have noticed something strange. I am not less capable than I was before. I still do my work. I still make decisions. I still plan and organize and carry out my responsibilities. But something has changed. I am less tense. I sleep better. I argue less. My days feel lighter, even when they are difficult. How is this possible? I have not added anything to my life. If anything, I have taken something away." The teacher looked at her for a long moment and said, "What have you taken away?" The student thought about it. "I think," she said, "I have taken away the need to be right." The teacher smiled. "And how does it feel?" The student considered this. Then she laughed, surprised by her own answer. "It feels," she said, "like setting down something I did not realize I was carrying." The teacher nodded. "That is the teaching," she said. "Everything you have set down, you can pick up again whenever you need it. Your knowledge is still there. Your experience is still there. Your skills, your judgment, your understanding. None of it has gone anywhere. But now, you are carrying it. It is no longer carrying you." This is where the journey of not knowing mind brings us. Not to emptiness, not to confusion, not to the loss of everything we have worked to learn, but to a different relationship with what we know. A relationship in which we are in charge, rather than our certainty being in charge of us. We can still plan. We can still prepare. We can still think clearly and act wisely and meet our responsibilities with care. But we can do all of this without the grinding weight of needing to be right, without the constant tension of needing to control how everything turns out, without the exhaustion of living as if the entire world depends on our opinions about it. We can hold what we know the way we hold the bird. Firm hands, open palms, a heart that is ready to be surprised by what life brings next. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this teaching, the part that the Zen masters return to again and again, is that we do not have to do this perfectly. We do not have to achieve some permanent state of openness. We do not have to become someone who never grasps, never worries, never tightens up. We are human. Our hands will close. Our certainty will return. Our old habits of control and insistence will rise up in us, as they always have. And that is fine. Because not knowing mind is not something we achieve once and keep forever. It is something we return to, again and again, 1,000 times a day if necessary. The hands close, and we notice, and we open them again. The mind grasps, and we notice, and we loosen. The heart insists, and we notice, and we allow. Each return is the practice. Each noticing is the practice. Each opening of the hands is a small act of trust in a world that is always wider, always deeper, always more surprising than we imagined. Let us pause here one last time. Feel the breath in you. Feel the weight of the body resting wherever it rests. And when you are ready, we will come to the close of this evening together. We have walked a long way together tonight, through mountain temples and weaving villages, through monastery kitchens and crowded gathering rooms, through stories that have been carried hand to hand, breath to breath, for thousands of years by the Buddhist and Zen traditions. And now the walking is done, and the time has come to rest. You do not need to remember any of it. Not the stories, not the teachings, not the names or the phrases or the moments that may have touched you along the way. Whatever this evening has offered you, it has already arrived. It has already settled into whatever part of you was ready to receive it. There is nothing left to do. But before we part, let us sit together for just a moment longer with the truth at the heart of everything we have heard tonight. We came into this world not knowing. Every one of us. We arrived with no opinions, no fixed ideas, no beliefs about how things should be. We arrived with open hands and open eyes, and the world poured into us, and we received it without question. A mother's voice was not labeled mother's voice. It was simply the most beautiful sound we had ever heard. The light that fell across our face in the morning was not called sunlight. It was simply warmth and wonder and the feeling of being alive. We knew nothing, and we were completely at home. Then, as the years passed, we learned. We learned the names of things. We learned the rules. We learned what was expected of us and what we could expect of others. We learned to plan and to predict and to protect ourselves from uncertainty. And all of this was necessary. All of this helped us find our way in a complicated world. But somewhere along the way, the learning became a kind of armor. We wrapped ourselves so tightly in what we knew that we forgot what it felt like to not know. We forgot the freedom of open hands. We forgot the relief of not having to be right. We forgot the closeness that comes when we stop holding the world at arm's length and simply let it in. The Buddha saw this. The Zen masters saw this. And for more than 2,000 years, they have been offering the same invitation in 1,000 different ways to anyone who is willing to listen. You can set it down. Not forever. Not all of it. Just for now. Just for this breath. You can loosen the grip. You can open the fist. You can let the cup be empty and trust that life will fill it with something you did not expect. And tomorrow, when the old habits return, when the mind begins once more to grip and plan and insist, you can meet that too with kindness. You can notice it. You can smile at it. And you can open the hands again, as many times as it takes. There is no finish line. There is only the returning. The part of you that is tired of trying to control everything, the part that has been gripping and planning and insisting and worrying, sometimes for years, that part can rest now. It has been working so hard. It has been doing its best, and it can set down its work for the night. The world will still be here in the morning, and you will meet it then, perhaps with hands a little more open, perhaps with a heart a little more willing to be surprised. perhaps with the faintest echo of those three honest words still resting somewhere inside you. I don't know. And that, as the old Zen masters have been telling us for a very long time, is a beautiful place to begin. Sleep well.